For those who have not had the opportunity to meet Acting Assistant Secretary Patricia Hoffman, she is a mainstay in D.C. Policymaking, has been with the department since 2007. I've had the opportunity to work with Acting Assistant Secretary Hoffman for a number of years. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Office of Electricity, it really is not only an R&D part of the department, but it really is at the forefront. If anybody's following policymaking, we'll really be at the forefront of any Build Back Better initiative. I really want to thank Patricia for her work of elevating transmission in the national discourse. It really is extraordinary to see how transmission policy making is happening at the congressional level, happening at the state level, and has been at the forefront of the discussions at NASEO's policymaking annual meeting here in Portland. So I did want to turn to Acting Assistant Secretary Patricia Hoffman for some preliminary remarks, and then get into questions as we conclude this day at NASEO. Acting Assistant Secretary Hoffman.
Thank you, Patrick. What an exciting introduction, but thank you very much for the kind of introduction and the opportunity to virtually speak with you all here today. I do want to take a moment and recognize the critical contributions that NASEO has made and the state energy offices have made with respect to electricity policy, transmission planning, security, and all the other important topics that you are covering today, that you have covered today and the next couple of days. I really think it's a great agenda. It's very timely and it's relevant. Transmission is an important topic, and we're really going to get into some details and some of my thoughts that I would like to relate to you today. Transmission and distribution systems, especially in the light of new technologies, our changing energy mix and electrification, demonstrates how critically important investing in our transmission and distribution system is. I'm not going to repeat any of the goals that were already discussed by the Secretary and others from the department. I know you've had multiple folks and you will continue to have DOE representatives in this meeting, but I know states across the country are leading the charge to develop policies to support climate goals, but collectively address some of the transmission and distribution infrastructure investments required in support of these goals, but also really actively discuss some of the challenges that we're all facing. We know transmission, we know grid infrastructure investments aren't easy. Additionally, I do want to recognize that in the wake of rolling blackouts, energy emergencies that have occurred in 20 and 21, ensuring grid reliability and resilience is also must be a top priority for state energy offices and regulators. Planners and policymakers have a very important role in understanding the risk that the states and the regions face and the financial impact from any damage to infrastructure, as well as rebuilding and reinvestment. So as I think about this, having a grid and looking at new grid architectures that can survive events, support clean energy deployment is critical to reliable service moving forward and protecting communities. It is no secret today that our grid is being pushed to do more than it was originally designed to do. And as we invest in grid modernization, we really have an opportunity to reshape it and look at how we potentially could re-architect both our transmission and distribution system. But there's a lot to do. And how do we really drive what we should focus on? How do we want to think about those strategic opportunities? And what insights can I provide for how we can work together and think about this from a state point of view, but also from a regional point of view? I have 5 major points that I would like to present to you today. The first one, of course, is focused on transmission planning and investing. We need to develop a transmission network that can have access to a diversity of energy resources looking at renewable energy zones or other geographical regions that you probably heard from EERE, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Alejandra's presentation earlier. But the three things that I want you to consider as we look at transmission planning and investment in the transmission system is, one, how do we really look at getting the most out of what we already have, which really is increasing the capacity of the existing system, whether it is with grid enhancing technologies or other capacity increasing infrastructure as we think about getting the most out of the existing transmission system. The second is, how do we strongly engage in transmission planning studies, scenario analysis, and risk analysis? The third is, from that information, how do we look at land use planning, rights of ways, multi-state collaborations for new transmission projects to be developed? I think the latter is really going to be the more challenging with respect to how do we build new transmission lines. I will say that we'll probably have some interesting conversations, if you haven't already, with respect to FERC's ANOPR process, focused around transmission planning, cost allocation, and interconnection queues. Some of the things that we look at is the transmission planning horizon is really short. We really need to look out 30 years and not the standard 10 to 15 years. How do we really think about the long-term kind of generation portfolio that will be invested in as we think about the clean energy goals? How do we really explore the different portfolio and different generation options that we have moving in the future? What is the role of high voltage DC lines and strengthening the interconnection between the seams are all questions that I think we need to address. And so how do we set up a framework where transmission planners and state policy offices can really engage in that discussion from a transmission planning scenario point of view, but really have confidence in how we want to look at investments moving forward? I think these are all important opportunities and part of the dialogue. As you're well aware, the national laboratories play a very strong role, and as well as there has been other studies out there on conceptual transmission diagrams and transmission pathways. And we really need to think about, how do we want to leverage some of these studies? What information do we gain from some of these studies? And what type of modeling do we want to look at moving forward so we can analyze scenarios, but analyze costs and benefits? NREL, does very strong work with respect to renewable integration studies that they've done in the past. In addition, the national laboratories have done interdependency analysis and risk analysis. But as we move forward, I still akin back to the CREZ model as we looked at renewable energy zones and ways to say what is the transmission requirements as we think about renewable investments moving forward. The second area that I wanted to bring up for your consideration and future dialogue is really strategically planning for energy storage. I know multiple states have energy storage goals, but ideally, how can we look at long duration storage, but storage moving forward? We won't be able to really go after our clean energy goal without some form of flexible generation and long duration energy storage. We recognize that we really ideally would like to have 8 to 12 hours of energy storage to support the grid as we move forward. I think we need to think about, how do we plan for storage, its placement, and how we can value storage moving forward. Recognizing that all forms of storage are viable. We can have it in support of substations on the transmission system to provide the ultimate flexibility. But we also can look at it as part of microgrids and distributed energy resources and pairing with solar systems, et cetera, to really provide a package in the community level. So there is a lot of benefit in both sides for utilization of energy storage. I know that you all are very familiar with the long duration energy storage shot. From an R&D portfolio, we want to continue to accelerate breakthroughs in energy storage. We want to reduce the cost of energy storage moving forward. The third area that I want to really bring up to your attention is really thinking about resilience moving forward. And how do we really look at a resilience measure and ways to evaluate risk as we look at grid infrastructure investments? And I know that Kate Marks from our Cybersecurity, Energy Security, Emergency Response Organization talked to some of you earlier today in her session about the energy assurance plans and opportunities really to think about energy insurance. But as we move forward, I really want to think about a comprehensive strategy that really takes in consideration climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and resilience while supporting kind of the reliable mandate that we have in supporting customers. So it's something to think about, as there are a lot of tools out there that we want to utilize as we think about resilience, but how do we marry some of those pieces together? The fourth area is really grid investment in support of vehicle electrification. Another important part of the clean energy portfolio and electricity modernization is really integrating electric vehicles. But what that means is, how do we support charging stations moving forward? As the market share grows for longer range electric vehicles, but also the trucking and the heavy duty vehicles for electrification, we are going to have to think about how do we want to invest in the infrastructure in support of this. The biggest thing that I worry about is we need to have intelligent managed charging solutions that really can allow for the electrification of vehicles without negatively impacting the grid. So we want to make sure that we capitalize on the benefits that electrification has, but we want to minimize any potential impacts as we look at infrastructure requirements moving forward. So we really want to think about that. We want to think about smart charging strategies, but also management of that moving forward. The fifth area that I wanted to bring to your attention really goes down to the distribution system and community development. I think as we look at infrastructure investments, we need to make sure that we really rethink the distribution system, how we can get communities and consumers engaged in the dialogue. I think as we move forward, we really need to think about communities and how we want to strategically integrate microgrids, grid interactive efficient buildings, virtual power plants, distributed energy resources, and other technologies into the distribution system. We want to make sure that communities are involved in any sort of investment from the transmission and distribution system. We want to make sure that we address any community concerns. We want to think about how do we add value to communities as we invest in the distribution infrastructure. I know earlier today, DOE announced several projects that will transform communities into state-of-the-art energy efficient buildings with these connected communities announcements. I think that's a great opportunity for the building sector to become grid friendly and help with that load profile as we move forward. I know that we have had success with some of the connected communities as we've done pilots in both Alabama and Georgia, and really have advanced some of the potential in this space. And so hopefully we can actually take some of the lessons learned and move it to additional communities moving forward. In addition, I know the Secretary launched the Local Energy Action Program, or Communities Leaps. Once again, this is technical assistance to communities to really look at a clean energy future. It's really looking at local energy driven plans to really think about clean energy, but really provide technical assistance for folks to think about their future. Once again, as we think about it, how do we plan for the future? What type of studies do we need to have? What technical assistance would be required? And how do we really develop that long-term strategy? Within the Office of Electricity, we've also recently announced the Energy Storage for Social Equity Initiative. It's a $9 million program designed to help communities better assess storage as a solution as part of the energy portfolio moving forward. And so that is another opportunity for communities to get tailored, locally tailored, specific technical assistance for energy storage projects. Now, I know most of you here want to talk about the infrastructure bill and really what will happen with the president's Build Back Better Act. And I think this is, once again, once in a generation opportunity. I'm not going to go through and repeat all the provisions that I'm sure you guys have been actively discussing throughout the day, but I do want to give you some insights and we can get into some questions in the dialogue period of how we can think about these elements. Really what we want to do is go after how these elements can build upon each other to allow for compounding benefits. And so let me give you a theoretical example of really how can we say when we're looking at transmission and capacity. I've really thought about expanding the existing system and then looking at existing rights of ways for easier siting and permitting of some new infrastructure. And then, of course, the long-term transmission investment of some of the more challenging projects with respect to siting and permitting. But as we think about just simply, how do we capitalize on the existing infrastructure? And with respect to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, what are all the opportunities that are out there from that perspective? You know, under the resilience provision in the infrastructure bill, there is the opportunity for reconductoring and looking at resilience investments moving forward. Under the smart grid provision in the infrastructure bill, there is an opportunity to look at grid enhancing technologies, looking at power flow control, smart grid technologies, but really looking at how can we look at some of the controls and communications on the grid opportunities. Also in the resilience, I forget if I've already said this, is the reconductor. I think I already said that, apologies. Then there is the energy storage provision, looking at how we can look at energy storage with respect to deployment of energy storage on the transmission system, but also in communities, which will allow greater flexibility and capacity and utilization of the T&D system. As we look at some of the state technical assistance areas, that can provide opportunity to say, how do we really think about this moving forward? What are some of the strategies? What are some of the incentives that could be out there? Where do we prioritize some of these investments? So as you look at all the different elements, there is a huge opportunity to knit some of these pieces together to really have a solid investment strategy as states think about their priorities and their activities. So within the Department of Energy, the department itself is really in a listening mode, but we're trying to really think across all the departmental elements on how to best utilize the infrastructure elements if appropriated and if authorized and appropriated. And so that is a huge opportunity for us to continue to collaborate with stakeholders, to continue to work with the state energy offices as you think about some of your policy priorities. But how do we implement some of these policy priorities really to go after the clean energy future? We recognize that we need to have transmission investments. So what is the best strategy to capitalizing on some of those high priority items moving forward? Now, in closing, I did want to at least do some acknowledgements and some thank yous to NASEO for all the hard work that they have done in partnership with the Department of Energy. Some of the things that I really wanted to acknowledge before closing is the NASEO Comprehensive Electricity Planning Task Force. It is one of the biggest and strong accomplishments that we've had over the last couple of years, really to look at electricity planning. It was a 2-year initiative that concluded in February, but it really it brought together 12 states to really think about some of the distribution planning models and some of the distribution investments moving forward. I'd like to recognize the Maryland Public Service Commission and some of the work they've done on a distribution system planning working group that really has a strong, important activity to look at gap analysis and opportunities for investments moving forward. I would also like to acknowledge the Wisconsin Public Service Commission and some of the partnerships there between NARUC and NASEO, as they really thought about microgrids and critical infrastructure investments around energy security and community resilience. As we think about hurricanes and other emergency events, we really want to have an enclave where there's a microgrids where people can go charge phones, talk to folks, look at repair and recovery activities moving forward. And so those are huge, just a couple examples of the partnership that I really would like to acknowledge and appreciate. So I look forward to further collaborations and discussions with you. And I thank you very much for your time. And I will pause there.
I want to turn to the audience with the remaining time that we have for questions. But to begin, I was struck with some of the discussion this morning about how resilience means different things for different regions. And as you assess potential opportunities for federal investments, what are the key technologies that you see are uniform across the region, across regions, that states really should be considering to integrate into their long-term resilience planning? And furthermore, if you could expand on the point about metrics, how do we ensure that investments are done and managed by utilities in a way that is using taxpayer dollars efficiently, or a combination of ratepayer or taxpayer dollars, that we actually get metrics and outcome to utilize the technology?
So Patrick, thank you for the question. It's an important question because there are different tools out there where states and communities can evaluate resilience. There is the National Academy of Science has done a resilience index. I am relatively flexible in looking at some of these tools. I think it really comes down to having a long-term strategy of how the technologies as it's deployed can demonstrate benefits moving forward. It is a difficult question. I don't know if there's a perfect answer, but it's something that I think we should work together as we have to quantify. I would love to have the ideal metric for every dollar invested in the energy space is X number of dollars saved. And FEMA does those type of investments for some of the dollars that they allocate. And it would be nice to have a specific energy type kind of metric moving forward. But I can't say that I've achieved perfection in that space whatsoever. So technologies that we want to think about doing and looking at resilience. You have your typical hardening technologies with respect to grid infrastructure, stronger poles, along those lines, your advanced meters for better restoration and faster restoration timeframes. But you also have microgrids looking at how do we really can look at critical services and being able to create microgrids, looking at communities and building things around that. And so those are some of the technologies moving forward. But I tend to probably, unfortunately, and I should correct myself, not focus on the hurricane type examples. We have the wildfire issues out there where there is technologies from the sensor side of things to look at asset management, to look at health of assets and look at predictive failure or potential opportunities or potential events where a fault may occur and you may have a spark on the system, which may lead to a wildfire. And so there's more conversations that are evolving from the wildfire perspective, recognizing the severe drought and the conditions that are occurring on the West Coast of the United States. And so that's important for us to think about. When I talk about risk, it's really looking at the risk that all the states, the different events that potentially could occur on the system.
I did want to ask if you have any, I appreciate how DOE has focused on transmission being a part of decarbonization. I think the public looks at it as traditional energy infrastructure and the externalities that presents, and not seeing the potential with a clean energy system that is delivered through the transmission system. But could you comment, you've been a part of this for a long time, of how you see states, the federal government really working to improve a permitting process that gives predictability for developers and also gets outcomes that actually has projects built?
Oh, that's such an important question. And goodness gracious, it's a question that I think we all got to work together on. So with respect to permitting, I guess my insights there is really, number one, can we take the lessons learned from past presidential permitting process to see if we can actually accelerate some of the language, some of the NEPA analysis, but really utilize some of the lessons learned from past projects. Number two, can we develop some web-based tools that continue to allow for better analytics around transmission, whether it is land use plans? I spoke to one state that really has analyzed the land use planning across the states and where transmission can be built, whether it's on existing rights of ways or whether it is along rivers and along routes that are more, what I will say, grid friendly from that perspective for permitting and siting of transmission lines. And can we capitalize on those opportunities? Then it comes down to, where can we utilize federal lands and land use planning with respect to the 368 process? And some of you are very familiar with that from the western part of the United States, and looking at the federal lands and how do we coordinate from that perspective. But if we can knit all these pieces together, I think we can really take a hard look at where the opportunities are for siting transmission projects. But I do believe we have to think about I'll use the message of how important transmission is for clean energy. And how do we really think about that as a package? It's not just traditional infrastructure, as you brought up, but it is really an enabler to everything else that needs to be done from a clean energy, from a climate, from a mitigation point of view. And so we're going to have to really think about that. Now, I will back up and say one of the things that I said is, can we get some more capacity out of the existing system? And so let's think about that in partnership with new transmission that's developed. And those become the opportunities moving forward.
Well, I will thank you for joining us. We wish you were here in person and hope it's next year that you'll be able to join us. But really thank you for your work over all the years and at this time when transmission, reliability, and resilience is at the forefront of a lot of state policymakers' minds. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, and I appreciate you.